Welcome back to the Formula Bone F1 show, the Formula One podcast that is absolutely not sponsored by Rich Energy. I'm Jared J-Bone Borislow, and I need to start the show off once again by sincerely thanking all of you listening right now for the massive outpouring of support that you've shown this podcast through the first 2 episodes thus far after debuting as the #1 Formula One podcast on Apple Podcasts after episode 1, thanks to you guys, even ahead of both of Formula One's official podcasts somehow. I still don't really believe how that happened, but amazing. Thank you all. All of you have showed no signs of slowing down in your support by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts and by reaching out to me with your feedback. I've received feedback from fans all around the world, from Russia to Singapore to Germany to Holland to Chile and more, which is insane to think about as I sit here in this race car bed in a bedroom in Austin, Texas right now. Back to ratings and reviews, though. The Formula Bone F1 show is currently at 360 ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts, which is amazing and has helped us shoot up the charts. But I don't want to stop there, folks. I don't. My challenge for y'all, I say y'all because I live in Texas, is to get that number up to 500 ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts by the next episode of this podcast. If we hit that number of 500 ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts by the next episode, I will do a special bonus episode of this podcast where I do my official ranking of my favorite 2021 season F1 drivers all the way from 1 to 21. Yes, I'll include Kubica, and you'll be shocked at where he lands if this happens by me getting 500 ratings and reviews in Apple Podcasts. So if you want to see that happen, go to Apple Podcasts, rate, review. Let's go, baby. Anyways, whether you rate, review or not, I'm so grateful that you're here right now listening or watching on YouTube. Thank you so much for the support. And away we go. First topic today, the 2021 Mexico City Grand Prix recap. Mexico was Max-ico this past weekend. I believe Crofty said that. As Max Verstappen absolutely was the best driver on the grid from the second the lights went out to just before his car was lifted onto the podium in the 4.0 Sol, which I do love. Lifting the car onto the podium. I wish they did that more, but I did say that Max was, the best driver on the grid from the second the lights went out to just before his car was lifted onto the podium in the 4.0 Sol. I say just before because his car lift, I think we can all agree, was significantly worse than Lewis's back in 2019. As Lewis's car was lifted, Lewis was standing on top of his car with his arms up, basking in the glory of his victory in front of tens of thousands of screaming F1 fans. As Max's car was lifted, Max was just quietly leaning against his car like it had just broken down on the side of the road and he was waiting for a tow truck. But the tow truck driver had just said it would be a few hours because, quote, "If you think I'm going to rush over there to tow a 2008 Nissan Sentra SL, you're out of your mind." Not like I would personally know what someone responding to that situation would look like or anything. I totally don't drive a 2008 Nissan Sentra SL. I drive something super fancy like a Rolls Royce or something like that. I don't even remember because it's just one of the many fancy and expensive cars I rotate through, none of which are, and I repeat, 2008 Nissan Sentra SLs. Okay, fine, I drive a 2008 Nissan Sentra SL and it sucks. Anyways, with Max's dominant victory and Lewis's ability to hold off a surging Checo and take P2, more on Checo in a bit, Max has now extended his lead from 12 points with 5 races left to 19 points with 4 races left. Unfortunately for Mercedes fans, things do not seem to be on the upswing for the reigning double champs, as Hamilton seemed frustrated all day with Mercedes' inability to compete with the pace of the Red Bulls. If these issues were even partially caused by racetrack altitude, as I discussed in my 2021 Mexico City Grand Preview, that is bad news for the Mercs, as the São Paulo Grand Prix is the second highest elevation race on the 2021 F1 calendar behind Mexico City. Now, it is worth noting that even though it's second on the list, the São Paulo racetrack's elevation is only around 1/3 that of Mexico City's, which just goes to show how insanely different racing in Mexico City is from racing anywhere else on the calendar and kind of anywhere else on the world. I think we should do a race at the top of Mount Everest. I don't have a reason why I think that. Would just be funny to me. I'd like to see how it affects the cars. Don't know how logistically you'd make that happen, but honestly, that's not my job as an F1 podcaster and content creator. It's, Michael Massey or whoever's job. All right, next up, let's talk about a guy who has certainly not had a good time in Mexico. A guy who was not that guy, pal, on Sunday. That would be Valtteri Bottas, or as we like to refer to him here on the Formula Bone F1 show, Todd Benson. The Red Bulls definitely had the pace advantage on Sunday and very well may have won the race even if the Mercedes had gotten the start they wanted from their front row lockout. But mother of pearl, did they engage in one of the greatest front row lockout botch jobs that I've ever seen. In a matter of seconds, the Mercedes went from P1 and P2 to P2 and P18. It's not good. What kind of defense of Max was that, Valtteri Bottas, aka Todd Benson? It wasn't good. And here are my thoughts on what happened with that disastrous, awful race start for Mercedes. So Bottas was in P1 and Lewis in P2. Lewis was starting on the dirty side of the racetrack. You probably heard that a lot during the broadcast. Now, it's considered dirty because it's on the non-racing line, the inside line, and thus dust and debris are kicked off of the racing line onto it. Especially in Mexico, the track is notably very dusty there. So if you saw at the race start, it was crazy. Just clouds of dust flying up, most of it from the dirty side of the racetrack. So starting on the dirty side of the track where Lewis was, that leads to reduced grip because obviously there's debris and dust under your wheels, so you can't get the, generally the start that you want. When you're starting from a standing start, you generally start slower because of that. So because of his position in a dirty P2, I think Lewis figured that he'd be able to get behind Bottas for a tow just by doing a normal start. So this was not the case for whatever reason, as the Mercs ended up side by side, which meant Max would then get Bottas's tow on the racing line with Lewis on the dirty inside. Very bad start. Almost couldn't have gone worse from that point. Now, Bottas still could have salvaged this awful situation by staying in front of the surging Max, but instead, he let him pass by on the racing line so that the two Mercs and Max were 3 wide heading to turn 1. Now, at this point, it's a who's going to break later race between Lewis and Max, and I think Lewis chickened out because of his position on the dirty side of the track, which allowed the late braking Max to take the lead, and he never gave the lead up. The rest is history. Now, if you rewatch the main straight into turn 1 of the first lap of the Mexico City Grand Prix, Lewis did brake very early, even for someone playing it safe. It was really early. If you watch the replay, you can see that both Bottas and Ricciardo expected Lewis to brake much later. Bottas has to do like this little pump fake where he turns in and then quickly has to turn back out. And then Danny Rick locked his brakes up because he was like, whoa, God, because Lewis braked so early and he wasn't expecting that. Now, those two things combined to make Danny eventually spin Bottas out, making him go from pole sitter to bottom feeder. So if you really look at it, Lewis caused Bottas's race to get screwed. Again, Bottas definitely did leave the door open for Max, in my opinion. But, it's not like just Bottas's fault. Lewis has a little bit of blame to take there. That was really early braking, like shockingly early. I don't know if he just felt bad about the dirty side of the track, but even then, I'm not a race car driver. I shouldn't be speaking about what is and is not braking too early, but it looked kind of early. Just saying. Again, it's worth noting that Max very well may have passed Lewis later on in the race, even had the Mercedes executed a proper plan going into turn 1. But we don't need to worry about that because he thoroughly owned them with world champion level driving from him and Haas level driving from the Mercedes. Shouts to Mick Schumacher. Race ended pretty early. To make matters more embarrassing for Bottas, he was then stuck behind Ricciardo, the guy who crashed into him, for what seemed like an absolute eternity. I loved that whole what Bottas is seeing all day meme that was just Danny's big old butt. That made me very happy. Probably one of the best memes from Sunday that I think McLaren ended up actually taking and then tweeting themselves, which I thought was pretty funny. By the way, if you're on Twitter during races, keeping up with all the live tweets, make sure you follow @FormulaBone, where I live tweet every race and every sprint race. If you're not doing that right now, what are you doing? Come on. J-Bone. Haven't done one of those in a while, I feel like. Okay. So Bottas was still able to contribute something potentially huge as he took fastest lap from Max on the final lap of the race after some awesome gamesmanship by Red Bull to try and deny him. They were like really trying to get in his way and kind of block him so he couldn't, take the fastest lap point from Max. What's funny is after Max crossed the finish line and took the checkered flag, Christian told him, "And you got the fastest lap too." And then like 10 seconds later, he's like, "And just kidding. Bottas took it from you at the last second, but you still had a great race, Max." So I really do enjoy these fastest lap taking fests that we keep getting. I mean, it's just fun to watch. I do wonder, like, it's kind of assumed now at this point, like you put the soft tires on, like you're going to get it. So I'm wondering if we're going to get a time where somebody tries to get it and doesn't, because we haven't really seen that yet this season, at least that I can recall, where somebody pitted for soft tires to take fastest lap and then either had a pit stop error and it screwed them over or just didn't get fastest lap. And again, all of these times where this happens, these points that are being, taken away or given could really, really play a huge role as this very, very tight race for world champion and world constructors champion comes to a close. Very exciting to watch, very fun. I think Bottas pitted twice. I think the second time they held him in there to give him like a better, so he'd come out and have like clean air in front of him. It was very interesting, very fun to watch. So a fun fact, Bottas set a new record on Saturday for most poles without a World Drivers' Championship. That is one of the saddest records you could possibly hold. I mean, it's like pretty much saying that you're a great driver, but you're not a legendary driver, which is sad. Not that I think Bottas is a legendary driver, but he's clearly a very good driver. But luckily, I'm totally sure at Alfa Romeo, Bottas will break that streak, will get his World Drivers' Championship. I am being sarcastic. Next up, Checo. Checo finished P3, as you all I'm certainly know, which caused some absolutely amazing scenes in the Foro Sol Stadium after the race. You would have thought that Checo won the race if you had turned your TV on for his post-race celebrations. I will say that I really thought he was going to take P2 from Lewis, and I was rooting for it so hard, very, very hard. I was screaming at the TV, but alas, Lewis gonna Lewis, and he was just better than expected. We knew it was going to come down to the last lap, and to be honest, Checo never really got that close. It was never, there was no side-by-side racing. There was no like DRS overtake battle. It was kind of Lewis's the whole time, which I feel like they really made us believe with like 20 laps left that Checo was going to, like he was like 12 laps away from an overtake. Concerning. I want to have better estimates. But somebody who didn't care that Checo finished P3 instead of P2 was Checo's dad, who was the absolute happiest man on earth on Sunday with his infectious smile and repeated fist bumps, hugs, and other actions of elation. More on Checo's dad later, but that man, if he doesn't put a smile on your face, I don't know what will. Just so happy for his son. It was very heartwarming. Charles Leclerc reached out to Checo after the race and said how happy it made him to watch how happy Checo's dad was for Checo. Very heartwarming stuff. Now, some other talking points. Giovinazzi is pissed, very pissed at Alfa Romeo after a very, very bad strategy by his engineers caused him to drop from P7 to P11. Now, Giovinazzi is very much fighting for his seat, and P7, I believe, would have been his best finish of the season, and he was, racing well, on pace to get it, but I believe he got called in to pit early because he was having some trouble with his rear tires. And when he exited the pit lane, he got stuck behind the amazing roadblock of Danny Ricciardo and Bottas and wasted a lot of his new tires on just being stuck behind them. So that caused him to, and eventually drop down to P11. Like I said, Giovinazzi's seat is still uncertain, and I have no clue whether or not he'll be back next year. It seems like now he's kind of losing the team. He on team radio, he like sarcastically said, "Thanks for the great strategy, guys." Italian Jesus is officially on the hot driver's seat. It's not looking great for Antonio Giovinazzi. Another talking point, the old guard did very well in Mexico. Vettel, Raikkonen, and Alonso finished 7, 8, 9, which is just cool to see. You'd love to see, the old dudes just bringing home some points. Very fun. And Raikkonen, of course, in his last season, we want to get as much Raikkonen points as we can, as much good racing after that, especially after he beached it at the USGP, which, again, I did see with my own eyes, and it was very sad. Finally, my last Mexico City Grand Prix talking point. A lot of people on Twitter were calling the 2021 Mexico City Grand Prix a bad Formula One race. They said it was bad. They said it was boring. Not enough overtakes. I have news for you. There's no such thing as a bad Formula One race. Formula One is like pizza or having a day off work. Even when it's bad, it's good. That's how I see it. There are no bad races. One exception. Spa. I did not have fun watching the Belgian Grand Prix this year. But that wasn't really a race, despite the fact that it was classified as a race and is going to play a major role in the World Drivers' Championship this year on those 2 laps behind the safety car, where, again, I think the safety car and the medical car should have been given points. They absolutely did the most laps and were the fastest. They led the pack. So, riddle me that. Support for the Formula Bone F1 show is brought to you by BlueChew, who is here to help you out just like Team Radio. Well, not like Giovinazzi's Team Radio. There are all kinds of reasons guys aren't able to quote-unquote perform. Age, medical condition, and for the younger guys, stress and anxiety. I suffer from stress and anxiety. I know pretty much everybody else does too in this time. Luckily, the chewables from BlueChew.com can help make sure you're able to perform at your best. BlueChew is a unique online service that delivers the same active ingredients as Viagra and Cialis, except in chewable form and at a fraction of the cost. BlueChew's tablets combat all forms of ED and can help men gain extra confidence for when it's time to perform. BlueChew is an online prescription service, so it absolutely could not be more convenient. There's no visits to the doctor's office, no awkward conversations, no waiting in line at the pharmacy, and it ships right to your door. And in a discreet package. The process is quite simple. Sign up at BlueChew.com, consult with one of their licensed medical providers, and once you're approved, you'll receive your prescription within days. The best part, it is all done online. I love doing stuff online nowadays. Order all my food online, go pick it up, don't have to wait in line. Ordering online, so good right now. BlueChew's licensed medical providers work with you to find the right ingredient and strength for your prescription. BlueChew's sildenafil and tadalafil tablets are chewable tablets made in the USA, and BlueChew prepares and ships direct, so it's cheaper than a pharmacy. If you could benefit from extra confidence when it's time to perform, visit BlueChew.com. Formula Bone F1 show listeners, that's you, can try BlueChew free. Free, F-R-E-E, free. When you use my promo code FBone at checkout, just pay $5 shipping. That's BlueChew.com, promo code FBone to receive your first month free. That's promo code FBone, and your FBone will be thanking J-Bone. Thank you to BlueChew for supporting the Formula Bone F1 show. Next topic, 2021 São Paulo Grand Prix. Let's go, baby. I am so excited for this race. Much like how we had a name change from the Mexican Grand Prix to the Mexico City Grand Prix, this race, formerly the Brazilian Grand Prix, is now called the São Paulo Grand Prix. Now, I had a lot of people reaching out to me asking what the deal was with the name changes this season. So I did a little research, and I believe these are the reasons behind the name changes. The officially stated reason why the Mexican Grand Prix's name was changed to the Mexico City Grand Prix is that the new name is said to emphasize the support that the government of Mexico City has given to the race. Now, my interpretation here is that this is part of Mexico's campaign to eventually have another race in Mexico added to the F1 calendar. In my opinion, this checks out because naming-wise, you can't have 2 Mexican Grands Prix, but you can have 2 races in Mexico. There have been rumblings of a Cancun Grand Prix in 2024 for a while now, and it's a project currently being championed by Sergio Perez's father, of all people. Told you he'd get mentioned again. Now, if Perez's father has the same enthusiasm for making this race happen that he does for cheering on Checo, oh baby, it's going to happen. And moving on to the name change for the Brazilian Grand Prix, I couldn't find an officially stated reason why the name change occurred, but it's well documented that Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro is trying to bring F1 back to Rio de Janeiro. So my guess is that, like with the Mexican Grand Prix name change, this is being done preemptively to make way for another F1 race in Brazil in the future. Now, through the course of doing that research right there to find out those facts, I found out some really interesting facts, and I love F1 facts. If you listen to this podcast, something you know is that I love F1 history and I love F1 facts. So here are some interesting facts that I learned during the course of my research. The Brazilian Grand Prix was held in Rio de Janeiro rather than São Paulo 10 times ever, the first time being in 1978, and then for 9 consecutive years from 1981 to 1989. All these Brazilian Grand Prix took place at Jacarepaguá, later renamed Autódromo Internacional Nelson Piquet, after the 3-time Brazilian World Drivers' Champion who won his home Grand Prix there twice. This historic racetrack of Jacarepaguá, which played host to F1 wins by legends such as Piquet, Reutemann, Prost, and Nigel Mansell, who, fun fact, I actually grew up by Nigel Mansell in Florida. Jacarepaguá was unfortunately demolished in 2016 to make way for facilities to be used in the 2016 Rio de Janeiro Olympic Games. Very sad. Never like to see a historic racetrack go away. Rest in peace. Now, Brazilian President Bolsonaro later wanted a privately funded track to be built on top of Rio's Camboatá forest so the Brazilian Grand Prix could return to Rio, but this plan was promptly shut down after deforestation backlash from Lewis Hamilton, among many others. He wanted to pretty much tear down this entire beautiful forest outside Rio just to build a racetrack when there's Interlagos, one of the most famous racetracks in the world, in Sao Paulo, not really that far away. So didn't happen. It's still said now that eventually, probably, F1 will return to Rio at a track that's not been created yet. Personally, I'm a fan of making tracks on existing city roads and just shutting down, downtown for a while. I want to see some F1 racing down the Copacabana, down the road outside the Copacabana, the famous Rio Beach. That'd be kind of cool. Imagine all the people playing beach volleyball in their bikinis and whatever else people wear. I feel like Copacabana is a very famous beach. People wear really crazy swimsuits because you're being seen there and stuff. But I feel like it'd be very cool scenes to have a Copacabana F1 race. So that whole story is why the race won't be in Rio de Janeiro and will in fact be held at the Autódromo José Carlos Pace, more famously known as Interlagos, after the Sao Paulo neighborhood in which it resides. So who is José Carlos Pace? Often referred to as just Carlos Pace, he was a Brazilian race car driver from Sao Paulo who competed in 73 Formula One Grands Prix from 1972 to 1977. His career highlights include 6 podiums and 1 victory at none other than his home Grand Prix, held at Interlagos in 1975. If you're only going to get 1 victory in your whole career, having it at your home Grand Prix is the way to do it. That's the one you want. I think anybody would pick that, right? I mean, maybe some people, if they really didn't care about where they're from, or maybe they race under a different flag than they're actually born in or something, maybe they'd want Monaco or Monza or some legendary track. But personally, I'd want to win the USGP and be a United States legend forever. Tragically, Pace was killed in a plane crash outside Sao Paulo in 1977, and Interlagos, the site of his lone victory, was renamed in his honor in 1985. Rest in peace, Carlos. As you guys know, I always highlight at least one past Grand Prix in my Grand Previews in order to give some historical background to present-day Grand Prix, as well as to keep F1 history alive and well. And this one is probably my favorite story I've gotten to tell yet. If you're a longtime F1 fan, you've been following it for a while, or maybe you've kind of looked into some of the biggest moments in the history of the sport, you'll know this story well. But I'm very excited today to get to teach and tell the story of this unbelievably legendary moment to new fans or people who watch the sport currently or watch Drive to Survive and haven't looked too much into the history of the sport. One of the most legendary moments in the history of Formula One took place on the final lap of the 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix, which was the final race of the 2008 season. This rainy race which was the final race of the 2008 season, like I said, had plenty of storylines, including the fact that it was 13-time F1 Grand Prix winner David Coulthard's final race. Sadly, he only made it through turn 1 before crashing in a very unceremonious last hurrah for him. You can now find him being a presenter for F1. However, there was no bigger storyline than the fact that this race would decide whether McLaren's Lewis Hamilton or Ferrari's Felipe Massa would be crowned the 2008 World Drivers' Champion. Going into this race, Lewis had a 7-point lead over Massa in the World Drivers' Championship. However, Massa had the tiebreaker over Lewis, having achieved more race victories in the 2008 season. This meant that Lewis only had 6 points to spare in this final race. Things got even more interesting after qualifying, when Massa took pole and Hamilton took P4. So back then, points were only awarded to the top 8 finishers, with no fastest lap point. And the scenarios for this race were as follows. If Massa won from pole, Hamilton had to finish at least P5 to secure his first World Drivers' Championship title. If Massa finished P2, Hamilton had to finish at least P7. If Massa finished P3, Massa would lose the World Drivers' Championship even if Lewis DNF'd, because P3 was only awarded 6 points and Massa needed 7. Oh yeah, it's also important to note that Felipe Massa is Brazilian, so he was hoping to come from behind in the final race of the season and become the first Brazilian World Drivers' Champion since Senna in 1991, and do so in Brazil at his home Grand Prix at a legendary racetrack in Interlagos. He had the entire crowd behind him. This entire crowd wanted Felipe Massa to finish first, Lewis to finish 6th or lower, have a Brazilian driver win the World Drivers' Championship in Brazil for the first time since Senna, who's right above me if you're watching the video. Ayrton Senna, above me. Yeah. If you were a fan of Massa at this race, you were pretty excited because Massa was pretty much in control the entire race. So it became clear to Lewis and McLaren during the race that Lewis would need to secure a P5 finish or better in order to be named 2008's champion driver. However, Lewis encountered calamity on lap 68 when Sebastian Vettel overtook him, causing him to drop down to 6th place behind Timo Glock, who was in P4, and then Vettel in P5. This caused a famous line to be dropped by commentator James Allen, "And the championship is slipping away from Lewis Hamilton." Very ominous. But this line from James Allen is nowhere near as famous as Martin Brundle's line 3 laps later. "Is that Glock? Is that Glock going slowly? That's Glock!" Timo Glock, who was in P4, his dry tires were no match for the wet conditions, causing him to have to slow down so much that on the second to last corner of the final race of the season, both Vettel and Hamilton were able to easily overtake him. Lewis took P5 and was crowned 2008's World Drivers' Champion, much to the dismay of pretty much every fan in attendance and the entire Ferrari team, who, I must point out, prematurely celebrated so hard that I am convinced to this day it's the reason they haven't had a championship driver. Nobody has ever jinxed themselves more than the Ferrari engineers, and who else was there? I think Massa's family was probably in there as well. Oh man, they were freaking out, and then you see one of the pit crew guys walk over and just be like, "Nope, you should stop because we didn't win," and then they all stop, and then it cuts to like Nicole Scherzinger, Lewis Hamilton's girlfriend at the time, just freaking out as well, and Lewis Hamilton's brother, I believe. Very, very, very crazy. And I would say most people, myself included, consider that one of the craziest ends to a race and to a season in the history of the sport. And it was relatively recently. I mean, it's with a guy who won the championship the last, 4 seasons. It's very, relatively recent F1 history. That's all-time F1 history. By the way, if Martin Brundle were commentating this race today, I bet his call would go, less like, "Is that Glock? Is that Glock going slowly? That's Glock." And more like, "Lewis Hamilton can do that because he did." It's a USGP grid walk joke. I hope you appreciated that. I should get like a laugh track. I'm just sitting here in a room talking to myself alone. I feel like maybe I can pretend there's a live studio audience or something. Something I can look into, Share the show with a friend. Maybe I can use that new listenership to convince myself to buy a soundboard. I actually do have a soundboard. It's like 5 feet away from me right now, and I'd probably break my race car bed trying to reach it. So something I can look into in the future, guys. Oh, if you want me to like get a soundboard, what sounds would you want me to put on it? That'd be kind of funny. Shoot me a DM with what sounds you want me to put on it. Anyways, I highly recommend that you go watch the Formula One YouTube accounts race highlights from the 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix. It is absolutely invigorating. I just watched it again, and it makes the hair stand up on every part of your body. And if you do go watch the Formula One official YouTube accounts race highlights from the 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix, make sure to comment Formula Bone sent me so that everybody watching that video knows that you listen to the best F1 podcast on earth. All right, everybody. Here, the moment you've all been waiting for, maybe. I don't know. The moment some of you certainly have been waiting for. Here are my storylines to follow for the 2021 Sao Paulo Grand Prix. Number 1, take a wild guess. Obviously, it's Max and Lewis. Max versus Lewis, as it should be through the end of the season, unless something crazy happens. So the Red Bulls crushed at altitude in Mexico and are on a hot streak in the Americas right now. Like I said, this will be another race in which altitude will affect car performance, albeit to a much smaller degree. So you have to give Red Bull the edge once again. If you look into the points difference, you'll notice that if Max makes it 3 wins in a row with a win in Brazil, things start getting pretty tricky for Lewis. If Max wins at Interlagos, even if Lewis takes P2 and fastest lap, Max's 19-point lead turns into a 25-point lead. Max has the race victory tiebreaker that I discussed earlier when talking about Felipe versus Lewis, where if you have whoever has the most victories, P1s throughout the season, wins the tiebreaker if there's a points tie. Max has that. Meaning if he wins on Sunday, he has a full race worth of points in hand over Lewis with just 3 races left. That's not including the fastest lap point, which would obviously be 26, the max you can take in. Now that I think about it, we also have the sprint race this weekend, which is worth points. You get 3 points if you're P1, 2 points for P2, and 1 point for P3. So that plays into this. Ooh, something fun to think about. Look at me. I'm just figuring stuff out live on the podcast. So that figure I just said kind of changes up when you factor in those points. In which case, it would even, let's say Max takes P1 in the sprint race, Lewis takes P2 in the sprint race, then Max would have an entire race worth of points over Lewis, including the fastest lap. Woo! Dang. Crazy. Of course, all it takes is a DNF in any of these final 4 races to blow this race wide open. The race for the title, that is. But Max is in great position to break Lewis's 4-year streak of being named World Drivers' Champion and become the first Dutch F1 champion ever. And I probably just jinxed him by saying that. Apologies to all you Max and Red Bull fans out there. My number 2 storyline to follow is this is the final F1 sprint race weekend of the 2021 season. F1 Sprint is back, baby! As many of you know from my videos, I love F1 Sprint. I feel compelled to remind you that both sprint race weekends have provided some of the best drama of the entire 2021 season, including the McLaren Monza sweep, and that, on a related note, Max and Lewis have collided during both sprint race weekends. Both. We had the one at Silverstone, where obviously that whole one happened where Max got crashed out. Lewis ended up winning the race. With that brutal 10-second penalty he had to overcome. Wow, what a huge deal that was. And then we had the one where Max landed on top of Lewis at Monza. Sprint race weekends are pretty crazy for Lewis and Max. And let's hope that this one is too. Obviously, we don't want a bad crash or anything, but I would like some drama. That sounds nice. I personally really enjoy Sprint as a race fan, like I said, though I completely see how the drivers think it needs to be thoroughly tinkered with. If you want to learn more about F1 Sprint, by the way, and how it changes up race weekends, which it does drastically, I made a video called F1 Sprint Explained in 3 Minutes that you can find on my YouTube page. Maybe while you're there, you subscribe, hit the bell so you get notified when I post. I just hit 10,000 YouTube subscribers, by the way. 10K. Thank you guys so much. I'm sure many of you subscribers are listening right now. If you're listening, go subscribe on YouTube. Let's get that number up higher. My number 3 storyline to follow is the Frenchman himself, Pierre Gasly. I guess the Frenchman himself could also be Esteban Ocon. Who knows? But if it's rainy, by the way, Brazil, it's in a rainforest. Interlagos is, so it can get kind of rainy. We all know Esteban Ocon, great rain driver. We know that they made a very big point about it in Drive to Survive, but we also know it because he won Hungary, which is a rainy race. But again, this segment is not about Esteban Ocon. It's about Pierre Gasly. The Frenchman, Pierre Gasly, is on his way to being a top 10 driver for the 3rd year in a row. You may remember that Pierre beat Lewis to the line at Interlagos last time around in 2019 and snagged P2 over Lewis for his first ever podium. Pierre is on an absolute tear lately, and it will be very fun to track him as he's on a hot streak at a racetrack that he excels at, and that means so much to him. Excited to watch Pierre. My final storyline, number 4, Ferrari versus McLaren. This might be the last time that I get to include this fight for 3rd place in my storylines to follow, because the Ferraris seem poised to run away with this. To give you an idea of just how dire things are for McLaren right now, over the last 3 races, the Ferraris have scored 52 points, and the McLarens have scored just 21 points. I crunched the numbers, and it looks like that's not good. It is just not good for the McLarens right now. Ever since Italy, well, I shouldn't say ever since Italy, ever since Lando, God, I don't want to talk about it. Lando at Sochi. I wanted it, Lando. That's still one of the saddest days of my year. Watching Lando spin around like he's just walking on ice. God. I don't like to think about it. So yeah, McLaren really needs to show up in Brazil, have a good qualifying, a good sprint race, a good race, because Ferrari is pretty close to locking this thing up and throwing away the key. Now it's time for a new segment, J-Bone's pre-race weekend picks for the top 5 Sunday finishers. This is not my qualifying or sprint picks. It is just my straight Sunday race top 5, who I think will be P1 through P5 come podium time on Sunday. My P5, I've got Pierre Gasly, baby. I just think he is crushing it right now. He loves Brazil. The Red Bull, he's an AlphaTauri, but the Red Bull generally has been doing well lately, and the AlphaTauri, his AlphaTauri has. Yuki is a different story, but I have Gasly at P5. I have Todd Benson, a.k.a. Valtteri Bottas, at P4. Sergio Perez at P3. I think he's going for his 3rd podium in a row. He's racing really well right now. The car is looking amazing. If you look at the race times, the Mercedes and the Red Bull are really far ahead of some of these other cars. So I think it's going to be Perez at P3, Lewis P2, and Max P1. Literally just the exact same thing as the last 2 races. But it's kind of how the Americas seem to be going, is that it seems to be going Max, Lewis, Checo. And I'm not going to buck away from that now. And those are my picks. I hope they're correct so I can be officially 5 for 5 in my first ever time debuting this segment. Let's hope. Support for the Formula Bone F1 show is also brought to you by Manscaped, who is here to help make you more aerodynamic by being the best possible way you can remove that body hair that's been keeping you from achieving peak speed and performance. Manscaping is the art of taming a man's unruly body hair, which spans from the chest pubes down to the ball fro and below. And if you're currently, like how I used to be, and are manscaping with the same trimmer you use on your face, don't say a word, don't ever admit it to anybody like I just did, and go to manscaped.com right now with promo code FBO. Manscaped offers precision-engineered tools for your family jewels. They just launched their 4th-generation trimmer, the Lawnmower 4.0, and it's the greatest groin and body hair trimmer ever created. The trimmer is waterproof, and it helps reduce a bunch of manscaping hazards, such as nicks, ingrown hairs, and grooming accidents. It also features wireless charging. It's some space-level technology right there. And it comes with 4 guard lengths for just the right trim. Manscaped also has a nose hair trimmer that I absolutely love. Get 20% off and free shipping with the code FBO at manscaped.com. That's 20% off with free shipping at manscaped.com. Use code FBO. Unlock your confidence and always use the right tools for the job with Manscaped. Thank you to Manscaped for supporting the Formula Bone F1 show. And thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Formula Bone F1 show. Don't leave yet, though. Don't leave yet. Don't turn it off, because I got some things to say. If you want to support this podcast, there are 3 ways you can do that right now. Number 1, rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts so we can push up the charts and reach a ton of new people who are looking for an F1 podcast. If we hit 500 ratings and reviews by next week, I will put out that bonus episode wherein I rate my favorite 2021 F1 drivers all the way from 1 to 21, including Kubica. So if you want to see that and haven't rated and reviewed yet, get on it. Next up, number 2 thing you can do to support the show: share this podcast with the friends that you love to talk F1 with so we can continue to grow this amazing new community together. Get your friends in. If you like the show, they'll like the show, because if you like something, your friends probably like it because you're friends with them. It's kind of how it works. The third thing you can do to support the show is support our sponsors. Seriously, guys, supporting the sponsors is a huge, huge way to support the show. If either of these sponsors sounds like an interesting product to you, please check it out. The first one is BlueChew. Promo code FBone for your FBone on BlueChew.com to receive your first month free. The second one is Manscaped, baby. 20% off plus free shipping with code FBO at manscaped.com. You can follow Formula Bone on social media everywhere at Formula Bone, including Twitter, where I live tweet every race, including this weekend's São Paulo Grand Prix, and YouTube, where I have full video episodes of every podcast. If you're somebody who likes to watch your podcasts, you can watch every episode of this podcast on YouTube, where I just hit 10K subscribers. Please clap. You can also follow me, JBone, everywhere on social media on my personal Twitter account at Jared Borislow. That is at JaredBorislow. And if you're all caught up on the Formula Bone F1 show, but when I keep hearing my voice, that I was going to say beautiful voice, but I don't think it's beautiful. I think it's fine. I co-host a comedy and mental health focused podcast called the Bolen Podcast, where we have a ton of fun covering a wide variety of topics, including but not limited to current events, non-F1 sports, fast food, funny news stories, cool animals, insane history, and more. We have a lot of international listeners, by the way, because I think we kind of give a slice of life into American culture. So if you're one of our many international listeners here at the Formula Bone F1 show, I think you'd really like the Bolen Podcast. It's a show about everything, like the opposite of Seinfeld, but just as fun. You can check out the Bolen Podcast wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. That's ROSSBOLEN, the Bolen Podcast. I'll say it again. Shoot me a DM on Twitter or Instagram at Formula Bone with your thoughts on the show or just to say hi, and I promise you, personally respond to you. If you don't believe me, test it out. Now, ideally, one day this podcast will get so big that I won't be physically capable of responding to every DM that I get, but that is not the case right now because you're an early Formula Bone adopter, and I'd love to hear from you because of that. So shoot me that DM, and I promise I'll get back to you. It's time for the NPR-style sign-off. The Formula Bone F1 show is brought to you by Bolen Media and hosted by me, Jared J-Bone Borislow. I also produce the show because I'm a content machine. Our new theme music is coming soon, but our current theme music is by John Yasut. You can follow the show on social media by following at Formula Bone everywhere. You can watch the show on YouTube by searching Formula Bone. You can help the show's launch by be successful, even more successful than it's already been, by supporting today's sponsors, as well as by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts, and by sharing this show with your friends. Until we meet again, J-Bone!